I have never understood when somebody does something that you agree with, why we would turn that person to some level of saint. The people on the political right do this all the time. They see somebody who says something they agree with, and then they're like, "Oh, look at this! They're the greatest person of all time. Give them a speaking slot at the RNC, and give them a show, and give them this." And then they let you down, as if somehow you're surprised that they would let you down. If you don't vet people, if you don't take time with people, if you don't let people prove that they're serious about their thoughts and they didn't just one time happen to get it right, you are destined to be very, very disappointed. With that in mind, do we believe Mark Zuckerberg when he says he has seen the light and now we're not going to have censorship on Facebook when he already told us there was no censorship on Facebook? Tony Katz Today. Good to be with you. Ed Morrissey joins me right now. He is the capo di tutti capo, the editor over at hotair.com. And you have got the piece over there. Meta goes MAGA. Of course, Meta, the parent company of Facebook, Zuckerberg and censorship now. But let's start with the fact that he's the guy who told us there was no censorship. So walk me through how it is you took what he said, and then do you believe him?
No, I don't trust him at all. However,
that is the right answer.
Yeah, I mean, how can you trust a guy who's been telling you that there's been no censorship, then makes a big announcement that we're going to end censorship in a place where there's been no censorship? I totally get that. However, I'm encouraged by this because it tells me that the incentives are moving in the right direction, right? The incentives are against censorship. The incentives are pushing towards free speech. And look, Elon Musk and Donald Trump have a lot to do with that. The election of Donald Trump has really sort of reset the speech field. And that's not necessarily even so much in the United States as it is in Europe. And I think that Zuckerberg is looking at what's going on in Europe and is worried that governments are going to start dictating content on Facebook there in the same way that they're going after Elon Musk right now. And Zuckerberg, for the last several years, has been being basically Neville Chamberlain, right? Which basically just negotiating the terms of his surrender, right? And I think he's finally gotten to the point where he realizes that the surrender is going to have to come at some point if he keeps continuing down that road. Now, the reason why we trust him a lot less than we trust Elon Musk is that Elon Musk didn't have the baggage of the previous years of Twitter. He bought Twitter outright and then immediately opened up the Twitter files, right? Matt Taibbi, Barry Weiss, Michael Schellenberger. There was other reporters who I know I'm missing. I think Yashar Ali might have even been one of the reporters that were given access to those files. But he did that immediately to expose the censorship that was going on from the government. Mark Zuckerberg still hasn't released the Facebook files. When he releases the Facebook files and details exactly how much cooperation they did.
You're talking about when he admits that they did the thing that we know that they did, that they have told us they didn't do.
Well, he kind of did.
No longer going to do.
He kind of did so sotto voce, and what's really funny about that, of course, is that he was partnered with PolitiFact and some other fact-checking organizations. He was funding them. I guess PolitiFact. I guess they all held an emergency meeting. John Sexton was writing about this last night. They all held an emergency meeting because the money just dried up, and they don't know how they're going to continue operations. And they issued a statement that said, well, we weren't censoring. That was something that Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook was doing. We were just telling them what the disinformation was. They were giving them that. They were making those judgments in full knowledge that their judgment of certain posts and certain debates were going to trigger the censorship actions at Facebook and Meta. Instagram, I don't know that WhatsApp was really involved in that because that's more point-to-point messaging. But Instagram and Facebook, certainly.
To just take a step back, talking to Ed Morrissey of hotair.com, first of all, WhatsApp is just like a texting service, if you will. It's a very secure messaging service. It's used internationally because it's just easier to operate. This fact-checking thing, we're no longer going to have fact-checkers. There's an organization of fact-checkers. And as you're discussing, very much supported by Facebook paying the fact checkers to do this, and they gathered this meeting. It was the Wonder Twins activate. They got the Hall of Justice all ablaze. You better pull out the extra seats because we're gonna need a seat for Apache Chief and Black Falcon. And they're like, what do we do about this system? And the first thing they do is say it's wrong to say that fact checkers aren't needed. Their first like job, and we saw this response from a lot of media, their first response was to say, this is so important for media that we have fact checkers for the media. We used to have editors, which did a lot more than just that. But I think the response from media, notwithstanding, it is this evolution, if you will, regarding Mark Zuckerberg. And I put forth yesterday that I don't believe that it's evolution, Ed. I believe that rather it is survival, and I am not necessarily opposed to that. That seems to be a capitalist looking at their business model, saying, how do we maneuver in this situation?
Well, I actually think that had he been acting as a true capitalist, he would never put himself in that situation in the first place.
Don't disagree.
Right? He allowed government to dictate the terms of his operation in a way that wasn't even regulation. This was just government pressure. It was irresponsible of him to respond to that. And to be fair to Zuckerberg, I think we should also note that when this first started happening, and I would say it was in 2017, 2018, during the whole Russia collusion hoax panic, right? And he was getting hauled in front of Congress, and members of both parties were haranguing him about controlling, misinformation on the platform. And initially he resisted that. And then he went all in part because Jack Dorsey went all in on Twitter. His competition did the same thing. And it wasn't until Elon Musk bought Twitter away from Jack Dorsey and the investors, because he took it private as well. Musk took it private at the time. That changed. That the situation changed. And for the last, 2 or 3 years, Musk has been the only one out there, and he's the guy taking all the slings and arrows. And the reason why I'm encouraged that Zuckerberg is now stepping up is it makes it much harder now to impose that type of censorship regime, because you've got more than one platform that's fighting for free speech and an end to government censorship. I would be more encouraged, again, if Zuckerberg would disclose all of the interactions that he had with the State Department and with the Department of Justice and other government organizations about controlling speech and censoring points of view. He hasn't done that yet.
You think that's coming, Ed?
No, because it will indict him. I mean, it'll make him look bad. No.
That is exactly right. And I don't disagree. That's the moment that you want to see. Talking to Ed Morrissey of hotair.com. I of course don't trust Zuckerberg, and I do understand your argument that the capitalists never would have done this anyway. But if the capitalism comes to him later, like he's a late bloomer, I say bravo. To quote Goodfellas in a very unkind, maybe crass way. Hey, you popped your cherry. That is absolutely fantastic work there. And I only argue that it's our job to hold him to it. But you brought up Elon Musk. And we're seeing right now that first, you can't open up Twitix, which I refer to now, Twitter and X, it's Twitix.
That's Twitix. I like that. Yeah.
That should be
sounds like a candy bar, though.
It does. That's Twix. I say TWITTX. Glenn Reynolds, Instapundit, uses EX. So somewhere in there, it's got to be accurate. You're seeing his tweets everywhere, his posts everywhere. It's all that you see. You're hearing about him in the news constantly. And then, of course, this conversation about Sir Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, these grooming gangs, as is being described.
Great gangs. It wasn't grooming. That was by force. So it was rape gangs, not grooming gangs.
I was discussing how they're described. You're discussing what it is they did. In either case, the British press and others can't believe that this is being brought up. This has to do with the Prime Minister when he was the lead prosecutor in Britain and failing to go after these gangs that raped young girls all across these areas. And so the question now about Elon Musk is, do you feel that there is a level of outsized influence going on with Elon Musk that media pundits, etc., now want to take everything he says and make it part of what they talk about, as opposed to finding other things to talk about or their own thoughts, because it's just easier to bag on Musk or feel that they've got to support Musk so they get some kind of better social credit.
Yeah, I don't know that I trust Musk either, right? I trust him more in the free speech issues because he's been consistent on that. And well, there's been some dispute as to how consistent he is within his own sphere on free speech. Look, nobody's perfect. And, what he's doing is he's doing good work that benefits all of us in the overall sense. And I am appreciative of that. But I don't know that we should trust Musk either. And yes, I'm a little concerned that you're going to have people who have outsized influence with the incoming administration. On the other hand, we've always had that. Right, it's always been a feature, and I would argue that it was a bigger feature of Democratic administrations than it was of Republican administrations, especially in the last, say, 20 years, when Wall Street has largely lined up until just recently behind the Democrat establishment. Right, you have George Soros, who just got a Presidential Medal of Freedom. I mean, he's been an outsized influence on American politics for a very long time, and there are people who will accuse you of bigotry for bringing it up.
Yeah.
The same people who are shrieking about Elon Musk's influence on politics are the same people who said you couldn't talk about George Soros or otherwise you're an anti-Semite, which is nonsense, right? I don't have a problem with people taking a critical look at Elon Musk's influence, but let's make sure that we talk about Warren Buffett's outsized influence and George Soros's outsized influence and Jamie Dimon's outsized influence. And all of that has been in benefit to the Democrat progressive establishment, which is the reason why the media doesn't like to talk about it.
But it is true. First, to the idea of George Soros, if anybody ever says you're an anti-Semite for bringing up the issues with George Soros, just tell them that your good Jewish friend Tony said it's fine. And that will, right.
I bring up you and I bring up Jeff Dunnett, and I say, "Hey, look, I'm covered."
Me and
Dunnett, some of my best friends are Jews.
Yeah, it's fine. Doesn't sound creepy at all. It's totally fine. Go ahead, feel free. But the outside influence of Soros and not being mentioned is true. But maybe I should be a little more pointed in it when I'm discussing the idea of almost God complex that people have towards Musk, that everything he says is right. He can't do any wrong. And that is not a conservative principle.
No,
that is a populist possible principle, but it is not a conservative one. And no, while I appreciate Elon Musk for doing what he did, he hasn't proven by any stretch that he's a conservative. Barry Weiss is all in favor of free speech. He's not a conservative either.
No. And I like Barry Weiss too.
Right.
I mean, but again, I'm not going to agree with Barry on everything, and I don't agree with Elon on everything either. And I think that there is an unfortunate tendency, especially in populist circles, and I'm not just talking about conservative populist circles, to create cults of personality. And we saw this big time with Barack Obama, right? We saw, we've seen it with other people. We started to see it try to form with Kamala Harris, right? Brat, joy. It didn't work. She is not the peg on which you can hang, cults of personality, but they were certainly trying to do that, right? And so you have to mistrust that. You have to remain skeptical and even maybe somewhat cynical about the impulses behind that. And that being said, it doesn't mean that they're not going to do good work and that you can't support what they're doing when they're doing good. But I think that it is still something that we should watch. How much influence does one person or a couple people have on the operation of the executive branch, and for that matter, the operation of the legislative branch too? Because there's an awful lot of influence that gets exerted there as well, and by wealthy people who are pursuing their own interests, and those interests might not always align with ours, and we should be cognizant of that. I'm absolutely in agreement with you on that. We rush to, and I'll give you another example of this, and I can't remember the young man's name, but do you remember? We were doing CPACs back in those days. This is maybe like 12 years ago, 13 years ago.
I think you're going to say CJ Pearson.
Not CJ, but he's another good example of this. It was Jonathan something or other. I can't think of his last name. And he was a 14-year-old that put out some sort of a, video that said, some conservative point of view. And everybody was in love with this guy. They gave him a speaking slot at CPAC and hailed him as, oh, this is how the youth of America is marching forward. And about 3 years later, he did what all teenagers do: completely changed his mind, started going from the other side. And at the time, I was like, you guys, he's 14,
Right?
he is not a fully formed human being. Don't hitch your star to this kid. You see this, Sam Kinison was a child preacher. People forget about that, about Sam Kinison, and became something completely different as an adult. People want to find shortcuts. And that's one way, creating these cults of personality around people that you don't know very well is a shortcut. It's a way to argue the bones of your favorite saint as opposed to the bones of somebody else's favorite saint. It's a trap. And so you're better off just sticking with the arguments and then making your, trying to convince people through the strength of your arguments, rather than just, wave the Elon Musk flag and say, well, he's with us over here. What's wrong with you?
Yeah, we can appreciate people without idolizing them.
Absolutely.
It is the difference between conservatism and populism, and it's all part of that old adage: the political left falls in line, the political right falls in love.
I think the political left falls in love too, though. They do. And I think Obama was a great example of that. I think we've seen other examples of that, but he's just the best one that comes to mind at the moment. Bernie Sanders, I think, is another example of that. There's nothing about Bernie that I don't even know how he got elected to the Senate, but because he was basically a ne'er-do-well before he got into politics.
He's a ne'er-do-well now. What are you talking about?
Yeah, exactly.
3 houses. His wife bankrupted a college and got paid for it. That's special.
Yeah, he's Larry David without the humor.
Right.
and I like Larry David, by the way, but I like his entertainment, but he's basically Larry David without the humor. And but there's this huge cult of personality around Bernie. And when you're talking about Bernie, everybody knows who Bernie is. That's part of the symptom of a cult of personality. I could be talking about Bernie Goldberg, who's a far nicer guy, by the way, and far smarter guy. But nobody, when I say Bernie, nobody thinks I'm talking about Bernie Goldberg. They all know I'm talking about Sanders. It's these cults of personality, and they erupt on both sides, especially among populists. And it's tough to argue with a cult of personality because they treat you like a heretic when you do. Even if you're mostly in support of the agenda, if you're off by just one, this was sort of the counter to what you said at the start. If you're off by just 1 degree, suddenly it's, burn the witch, and they're weighing you with the, in comparison to a wooden duck and see if you float. I mean, and Sir Bedivere's out there with the peasants.
Look at that. A Monty Python reference. Close this out. Ed Morrissey of hotair.com. I appreciate you taking the time to be with us. Find everything at TonyKatz.com. This is Tony Katz Today.